So at this stage, we've got the skin texture painted in. It's blocked in to a pretty high degree, but we're still going to go through and do a little bit of temperature variation later on, just by using that spatter brush and bringing some more warms into the ears, for example, or across the cheeks and nose. We'll use some browns, both raw umber and burnt umber, which are basically just warm and cool browns. We'll use those to freckle and speckle the skin, as well as to do some contouring, which means we're going to shade into the shadow areas, just to help accentuate the form and the bone structure by painting in a little bit of shadow. It's not a cheat, it's what people do when they put on makeup. They will accentuate or de-accentuate aspects of the face just by adjusting highlight and shadow. And we're going to do the same thing on this guy. But at this stage, I want to go ahead and start looking at the horns themselves. We've got a nice block in here for the horn texture. But what I want to do is I want to use ZBrush to go in here and actually paint some horn texture. We're going to project this off of some photo reference. The photo reference are just photos I've taken of an animal horn that I have here, and we'll use that in conjunction with some of our paint technique just to block in a real nice texture for these horns here. The ZBrush plugin that we're going to use, you'll need to install. You can download it from ZBrush Central or at pixellogic.com. If you go to the download center, it's available there for free. And it's accessed under the document window. You'll find ZBrush here. Now ZBrush allows you to create a seamless connection between ZBrush and Photoshop. What it will do is it will export your document as an image in Photoshop on which you can paint, and then you can export it back to ZBrush, and then everything that you've painted will then be projected into the 3D color texture. Now I'll go to Document, ZBrush to bring ZBrush up. But before I do this, I want to make sure that my document size is a reasonable size. If I click AA half, you can see that my anti-aliased half-size document is pretty small. What I want to do is make sure that my document size is actually about twice this size. Because when you're using ZBrush, Photoshop is actually bringing the document back into ZBrush, and all that texture information is being reinterpreted through the document window. So if your document window has a very low resolution, it's going to eat away at the quality of your projection. That's really the only drawback to ZBrush compared to something like Spotlight, which is a texturing tool that's built into ZBrush. I'm electing to use ZBrush for this because I think it's an important plugin to understand, and it also gives you, I believe, more powerful options because it gives you the entirety of Photoshop's warping and liquify and texture tools and painting tools, whereas Spotlight just has its own set of brushes and tools that have been built in. So to correct this, we'll just go to Document and we'll click Double, and that will double size this document. Click Yes, and now it's going to drop that image to the canvas. Just Control N will clear the canvas. That's essentially going to layer and clicking Clear. The hotkey for that would just be Control N. Now if I anti-alias half, you see I've got a larger document. I can draw my guy back out, go into Edit Mode, and we'll zero back in on the horns here. Now you can do this one of two ways. You can zero in on both horns, like that, or you can zoom in. I'm going to turn off perspective for this, by the way. I just press the P hotkey to turn off perspective. You can zero in on the horn like this, and we'll do both of them individually. Another thing worth remembering is that ZBrush will actually respect masking. So I can mask out everything that's not the horn here, and it'll save the head from getting any sort of overspray and any sort of projection from ZBrush, which we definitely don't want. So I'm just going to take a moment here and I'm going to quickly mask out these areas. And we could just use a masking marquee for the large areas here. There we go. Now I'll zoom into that horn. So here we are. We have masked the head. The horn is unmasked. I have baked all of my layers down, so now all of that paint is baked into the model, and we're ready to project some horn texture on. So I'm going to go to Document, and I'm going to press the Z App Link button. And the Z App Link button is going to bring up Photoshop. So if I go to Document, click Z App Link, it brings up the Z App Link projection window, and I will click Drop Now. You can turn on double-sided here, and that'll project that horn texture through to the opposite side. It can be time-saving, but be aware that it will create stretching along the top and the bottom. So I click Drop Now, and it's going to automatically bring me over to Photoshop. I had that document open already, so this is what you'll see. It'll bring up your ZBrush document window as a Photoshop document. And in your layers here, you'll see there's a shading layer, a color layer, and then a shading back layer. The only one that you want to manipulate is this one here, or create new layers on top of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of these photo reference images that I've got here of horn, and this is actually something that I've supplied for you to use. I'll just copy that selection, come over here, and I'll Control V to paste it in, Control T to go into transform mode, and I'll start shifting these around, and we'll position this about here. Go back into transform again. This time I'll go into warp, and I'll just scoot this texture sample around a little bit. Go into eraser, and I'll just feather the edge a little bit. And I don't need to worry about where I'm overlapping the skin, because there's a mask there. It's not going to overlap onto the skin area. So before we can go back to Photoshop, or go back to ZBrush, I will Control E to merge this down into this layer here, and I will click Preserve to preserve the mask, Control S to save, and then Alt Tab back to ZBrush. ZBrush asks me if I want to re-enter. I click re-enter. It'll apply that texture. If I leave double-sided turned on, it'll project through to the back side, and now it's just writing that into the polypaint. So you can see we lost a little bit of resolution there, but that is our texture coming over from Photoshop. Now the reason we lost color texture resolution is because the horns here, they're actually, if I zoom in on them, you can see our faces are stretched a little bit. If I go into frame mode, you can see there's not a whole lot of concentrated geometry there. And that's because we've pulled a lot of shapes out from that underlying base mesh. Now there's a couple ways to get around that. You can just go ahead and texture on top of this and work with the resolution you've got, and then go into your texture map later on and add a little bit more detail. That's probably not as desirable as painting it in directly, in which case you can try and divide the model again. If I go into frame mode, you can see I've actually got polygroups already for the horns, so I really don't need to worry too much about losing my mask here. What I'll do just before we move on, I'm just going to go to polygroups and click from masking. Oops, not from polypaint, from masking. Now I should get a clearer, there we go. Actually, I don't like that. I'm going to click group visible, and then I'll click from masking. There we go. Now I've got a polygroup for my horns, so I don't need to worry about losing that mask that I've created. So I can clear the mask, and we can try and add one more subdivision level. So if I click divide one more time, it's going to give me another subdivision level, and that's going to give me far more detail in the horn area. So now if I zoom in, Control Shift click on the horn, and because I've got that polygrouped, what it's going to do, it's going to hide the head, Control click to mask, and then Control Shift click on the background to reveal all again. Because there's so much geometry now, that's going to take a little while. Let ZBrush think. Now we've got the mask, or we've got the head visible. We have a mask just on the horn area. Oops. There we go. We've got our mask visible on the head. We've got the horns isolated and ready to accept texture. And we've increased it by a subdivision level. So I'm going to go ahead and go to zoom out here and position the horn again. Now we'll go back to Document, ZBrush, double-sided. And I'll do the same projection again this time. You'll see we'll get a much higher quality. Click Update. I'll paste my photo texture back in, go back into Control-T for transform mode. I'll just rotate this around, get it placed about where I want it. Go back into transform again and select warp this time. We'll warp this texture to conform. Merge down and preserve the layer mask. Save our work and then Alt-Tab back to ZBrush. And you'll see we'll get a much higher quality transfer this time because we've got more geometry in this horn area. It might also slow the process down just a little bit because it's dealing with many more polygons. There you go. You see we get a much higher quality now. Now let's say, for example, wanted to continue that down the length of the horn. Go back to Document, ZBrush, drop now. We'll click Update, and then again I'll paste that horn texture in. Go into transform mode, and I'll scale it down. And we'll taper it a little bit. Merge down and preserve. Save your work. And I'll actually go in here and I will paste that reference in one more time. Just so we can continue this down to the end of the horn. Save our work, Alt-Tab back to ZBrush and click Re-enter. Pick up now. And there we go. So we get our photo reference projected down onto the horn. Oops, zoomed in too tight. Now you can repeat the same process for the other horn. And then we'll go in and do some painting just to accentuate the highlights and the recessed areas, just so we're not relying entirely on that projection. Now if you want to get an even higher resolution here, you don't have to use standard geometry levels. You could do all of your poly painting within HD geometry. And it's beyond the scope of this particular tutorial, but if you use HD, you are able to do all of this poly painting onto up to a billion polygons. You get extremely high resolution detail, but you're not able to use layers, so there is a bit of a trade-off. So let's go ahead and save our work and take a look at some other approaches.